fiery exchange between Representatives Chip Roy and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on cobalt mining, electric vehicles, and America's energy future.
EVs by 2030. So if we follow those mandates by the Biden administration, that debate aside, right? Debate for a different day. If you follow those mandates, you got to have a massive, massive amount of battery production. And by all indication, the vast majority of that Congo production is controlled by China. A huge amount of that has child labor and other issues that we've talked about. And you got trafficked child slaves that are reported in the production of it. Why on earth would we want to limit the ability of Americans to go mine cobalt? Now, I might say, well, that's kind of great because I actually still want the internal combustion engine. I actually think it's more affordable and better for the American worker who wants the plumber in San Marcos, Texas, to be able to go to work and afford the car. But if you buy into the motion of having, EVs that you can drive all over creation, even if you're from Texas and you had to do like I did, I appreciate the chairman pointing out the passing of my grandma. I had to drive 6 hours, like 300 miles to go see my grandma Thursday before she passed away, and 6 hours back. I couldn't do that in an EV.
So Chip Roy starts off with some pretty bold claims about the Biden administration's push for electric vehicles. He argues that the administration's mandate to have 2/3 of vehicles be electric by 2030 would require a massive increase in battery production. Roy then makes an economic argument that hits close to home for many Americans. He claims that the Toyota plant in San Antonio, which is not Chinese-owned, will soon be forced to convert nearly their entire assembly line to producing EVs because of the administration's tailpipe regulations.
I wouldn't have been able to make the round trip in time. But okay, assume we were able to ever produce batteries that last long enough, the charging stations, all the stuff. Why would we get rid of the American production of it?
Thank you. There are several different components to your question. I want to make sure that I address them. First and foremost, on the issue of child exploitation, child labor, I think it is the role of the United States for us to push back forcefully on this production, and not just in the production of energy, but across the board. We see this in textile production, energy production, cobalt mining. It is horrific. And we need to make sure that our sources do not include child labor. But to get to the core of the question, too, on the China front, is that I find it interesting that there is this concern about Chinese ownership of minerals, and it is legitimate. However, the response to that seems to be deregulation specifically for companies that are largely Chinese-owned here in the United States. These companies are subsidiaries where the benefit of what we are deregulating here, and I'll give you a specific example. I would be remiss not to mention that the minerals produced specifically at the proposed Twin Metals mine that is implicated in this legislation would most likely be shipped to China for refining and smelting to be sold on the global market. These are not American-owned companies that American mined minerals would be going to. And so if your concern is the Chinese predominance of ownership in the mining market, I would be very concerned about passing this legislation. So that, I think, on the China piece there. And lastly, on the meeting our targets and mining cobalt. I think it's a false choice to say that in order for us to mine cobalt, we either have to destroy some of the most sacred lands in the United States or rely on child labor. There's responsible mining in the United States that is available to us. But secondly, I also find it interesting that the majority presently pushes back against battery recycling, which would allow us to open the path to reducing our reliance on mining in general. There is enormous potential in recycling many of these EV batteries, but we have not made the investments or the shifts necessary in order to unlock that so that we can reduce our reliance on solely mining as the only source of battery. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Before I give my colleague a chance to respond, as I think he probably wishes to, I would only note that happy to have a conversation about restricting Chinese ownership of any number of corporate activities in the United States, or ownership of farmland, or ownership of land near military bases, or frankly, ownership of meat packing, production, including mineral production and so forth. A significant reason why it would be mined here and shipped back is because they've got all the production facilities, because they've been building and mining these because they've got the resources.
According to Roy, this will drive up vehicle prices and make cars less affordable for average Americans, while doing little to address global emissions when compared to China's ongoing coal plant construction.
To do that. And here we've got the God-given benefit in America being able to produce very clean burning natural gas, very efficient ability to have automobiles that have an internal combustion engine, which are basically fractionally about a 1.5% of the CO2 production when you compare it to what we're producing in China, as the gentleman noted, where they've got 1,100 coal-fired plants burning in China, and we have 250, and they're building 2 a week, and we're building none. And yet we're building no nuclear plants except for the Georgia plant that was finally put online 45 years after it was permitted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I think if we're going to be serious about it, we can't say, I just don't accept the premise that this sort of general notion of, well, we got to push back on the child labor. Well, I mean, we're going to use that child labor unless we find a supply right now, because the Biden administration has put their foot on the gas to say we must have EVs in 2030 at the extent of 2/3 of our entire production line. So Toyota is not a Chinese-owned company, but Toyota has a massive production facility in San Antonio, tells me that they will largely have to put their entire assembly line starting next year into EVs pretty much only because they can't financially afford to do otherwise with these mandates on the tailpipe rule, which will be shutting down the internal combustion engine production of the Toyota vehicles. No Chinese ownership there because that's where they are, which will then mandate the EVs, driving up the price of those vehicles, and then they got to go figure out.
Both representatives agree that child labor in mining is unacceptable and that Chinese dominance in critical minerals is concerning. Where they differ is in the solutions. Roy advocates for deregulation of American mining and preservation of internal combustion engines, framing it as a matter of affordability, practicality, and energy independence. AOC pushes for responsible mining practices, investment in recycling technology, and careful consideration of who actually benefits from American deregulation policies. The questions we're left with are profound. Can electric vehicles ever be practical for all Americans? Is there a way to produce batteries without exploitation? And how do we balance immediate economic concerns with long-term environmental goals? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.